Hello and welcome back to Introduction to the Philosophy of Religion. In this segment we're going to stick with the notion of creation and we're going to look at some of the philosophical issues surrounding it. Now, the idea of creating something from nothing is a difficult one to get our head around. A good part of the difficulty is that there's just no obvious examples of it happening in our everyday lives. Dress designers might talk of their creations, but obviously these were not literally created from nothing, as the designers used pre-existing fabric and threads and so on. Other things we would normally talk of as created are in the same boat, as we saw in the first segment of this week's topic. So think of creating a table, a poster or a website. If we want to find something from everyday life that comes close to an analogy of creation from nothing, perhaps the best example would be creating a story or a piece of music. I'll leave it with you to decide how good an analogy there is between our creating a story or piece of music with God's creating from nothing. One philosopher claimed that magic is the closest analogy we can find to creation from nothing. So he says, there's one phenomenon that has some resemblance to what seems to be meant by the idea that God causes the world out of nothing. And this is the phenomenon, or supposed phenomenon, of magic. God said, let there be light, and there was light. The magician says, abracadabra, and the genie comes out of the bottle. Just to be clear, this is not intended seriously. The point is actually that there is no uncontroversial analogy of creation from nothing in everyday life. The difficulty in finding an example or analogy of creation from nothing tells us that creating from nothing is very rare. Humans can't do it, animals can't do it, nor do we find any examples of it happening in the natural world. Perhaps genuine creation from nothing, from absolute nothing, is something that would be possible only for God, assuming that it's possible at all. What we'll do in this segment is assess the idea of creation from nothing against the alternative view, creation from pre-existing materials. And we'll look to assess the ideas philosophically. In the previous segment, we've already considered the theological basis of the idea of creation from nothing by looking at different sacred writings and creation stories, so there's no need for us to go over that again. Now we could, I suppose, consider the scientific evidence here as well, though I suspect that would be pretty unhelpful. Although there are scientists who are happy to discuss the issue of the universe coming into existence from nothing as part of the Big Bang Theory, they tend to miss the point in quite a big way. For example, in a book called A Universe from Nothing, a theoretical physicist called Lawrence Krauss claims that our universe arose naturally and inevitably from the operation of gravity on the quantum vacuum, which is empty space teeming with virtual particles that spontaneously pop into existence before disappearing again. Now hopefully you will have already spotted the serious problem with Krauss's suggestion, which is that gravity and the quantum vacuum are clearly not nothing. They are something. And most scientists who discuss the issue fall into the same trap. When they say that the universe came into existence from nothing, they actually mean the exact opposite, because they say it came into existence from the activity of strings or membranes or something else. But clearly, strings and membranes are something, not nothing. In a way, it's not surprising that scientists can't or don't want to talk of true nothing, because true nothing would not be open to scientific investigation. There would be quite literally nothing for the scientists to study. Scientific theories are always about something, whether that be gravity, strings, membranes, or something else. The idea of pure nothing, of nothing whatsoever, is not one that would be encountered in physics at all. In fact, the idea goes beyond physics and finds its home in metaphysics. So it's definitely a philosophical matter. So let's weigh up the two possible doctrines, creation from nothing against creation from pre-existing materials. So we'll start by considering a reason in favour of the doctrine of creation from nothing, before we look at reasons against it, and then finally we'll look at a reason in favour of the rival doctrine of creation from pre-existing materials. So what advantage is there to supposing that God created from nothing? Well, the main advantage lies in the notion of God. The idea that God created from nothing seems to involve a more exalted notion of God, or at least of God's power, than the rival idea that God created from pre-existing matter. After all, bringing the universe into existence from nothing would presumably require more power than just organising materials that are already there. At the very least, we could say that a God who can create from nothing is able to do at least one thing that a God who creates from pre-existing matter cannot do, namely, create something from nothing. Many philosophers and theologians have preferred the doctrine of creation from nothing over the alternative because it stresses God's unilateral power over the world, as one philosopher puts it. And certainly creation from nothing is the ultimate display of power, and I doubt we could think of anything that could rival it. If creation from nothing is rejected, this may have implications for what can be said about God's power. Indeed, if God did not create from nothing, then there may be restrictions on what God can accomplish. And those restrictions may in turn have implications for other religious claims that are grounded in God's power, such as miracles. So in this respect, there is a definite advantage for the doctrine of creation from nothing. Of course, some might think that the emphasis on God's ultimate power is actually an off-putting feature of belief in creation from nothing, because it leads us to glorify or idealize omnipotence. And this point is often found in the work of feminist philosophers of religion. For example, Beverly Clack writes that idealizing omnipotence contains the belief that absolute power is an absolute good. After all, God as perfect is defined as all-powerful. It would seem that in glorifying divine omnipotence, human beings, or rather human rulers, are similarly encouraged to seek after such power. So, if God's power is pushed to the limit, as it is in the doctrine of creation from nothing, it leaves us with a despotic image of God, which may inspire a drive for power in others, as well as perhaps being off-putting in its own right. So now we're starting to see possible problems with the doctrine of creation from nothing. Now there are other implications of stressing God's absolute power in the doctrine of creation from nothing. And one of them is that if God did create from nothing, then God is surely responsible for all of the suffering in the world. The thinking here is that a God who creates the universe from nothing has complete control over what exists and happens in it. Such a God would have been able to create the world free of suffering and ensure that it stayed that way. Now, obviously, the world isn't that way at all, which raises the question of why a God able to ensure that there would be no suffering opted to create a world in which there is suffering. This is, of course, the classic problem of evil, and we'll look into it in more detail next week. What we can say now is that the problem of evil is a much bigger problem if God is thought to have created from nothing than it is if God is thought to have created from some pre-existing materials. And we'll consider why this should be in the seminar. Now, a further problem with the idea of creation from nothing is that it seems to conflict with the claim that God is essentially loving. To understand the issue here, let's start by supposing that God is loving, and that this God freely created the universe from nothing, but might have freely decided not to create anything at all. And these are common claims among theologians of various religions. Now let's go back to the point where only God existed and there was nothing else. Before deciding to create, theologians say that God was still loving. And they say this because being loving is thought to be not just an attribute of God, but an essential or necessary attribute of God. In other words, it's an attribute that God always has had and always will have because it's part of God's very essence, such that God could not be God without it. In the same way, many will want to claim that God could not be God without being omnipotent or omniscient and so on. So, prior to creating anything, we have a God who is essentially loving, who always has been loving and always will be. The traditional account has it that God then made a free choice to create the universe, but this was not in any way inevitable, and the decision may have gone the other way, with God freely deciding never to bring anything else into existence. So that's the account that a lot of theologians endorse. But if we dig a little deeper, we start to see problems emerge. According to this account, before creating anything, there was just God and that's it, nothing else. And there were two possible outcomes. God might freely create a universe or freely decide not to create anything at all. So let's now do a thought experiment and consider both of these possible outcomes, starting with God freely deciding not to create. Now, if God had decided not to create anything at all, that means for all eternity there would have been just God and nothing else. In such a situation, there would never be anything at all for God to love. In which case, how could God be considered loving at all? It doesn't seem obvious how God could be considered loving in this situation. In order for a person to be meaningfully described as loving, there must be something or someone else in existence for that person to love. So it looks as though there's a problem in maintaining that God is essentially loving and that God may have freely decided not to create anything. Okay, let's continue with the thought experiment. We're going back now to the point where there was just God and nothing else, right? We've just looked at one of the possible outcomes where God just didn't create anything. The second possible outcome is that God freely decides to create. But again, would it really make sense to think of God as essentially loving in this situation? For surely a being could be considered loving only if or when there is something, some object or objects upon which it can bestow its love. And if there was a point when it was just God and nothing else, then it seems difficult to see how God could be thought of as being loving at that point. After creating the universe, yes, God has something to love. But before creating the universe, this isn't the case. So it seems that God could be considered essentially loving only after bringing the universe into existence. Before that, it's unclear how God could be considered to be loving at all, because what would there have been for God to love? So to sum up the problem, if God is essentially loving, then it must be that God always has been and always will be loving. Now, if God had freely decided not to create anything, there never would have been anything for God to love. So it seems in that case, God could not be essentially loving. And if God freely decided to create something, there would be something for God to love only after the act of creation, not before. So again, it seems that God could not be essentially loving, because it would not be correct to say that God always has been loving. So if there ever was a point when God existed and nothing else, as the doctrine of creation from nothing maintains, there are two possible outcomes, and in neither of them does it seem true that God always has been and will be loving. In which case, under the doctrine of creation from nothing, it seems God cannot be essentially loving. And this is obviously a serious problem for theologians and philosophers who want to assert both that God created from nothing and that God is essentially loving. Now, incidentally, some philosophers have turned this objection to creation from nothing into a positive argument for thinking that God created from pre-existing materials. So this argument works either by drawing out the implications of God being essentially loving, or by drawing out the implications of God's being essentially good. So let's consider the argument in terms of God's being essentially good. Now, according to this version of the argument, goodness is a propensity to do good. And that makes sense only when there is something that one can do good to. So, if God is eternal and essentially good, then that implies that there must always have been something for God to do good to. In other words, God's essential goodness presupposes the eternal existence of something else to which God can do good. This in turn implies that it was not up to God whether this something else existed or not. For how would it make sense to say that God is essentially good if there was, and may always have been, nothing besides God? In which case, the argument goes, there always must have been something existing alongside God, which suggests that God did not create from nothing at all. Okay, let's recap. In this segment, we've looked at some of the philosophical issues that arise in connection with the doctrine of creation from nothing, and with its rival, the doctrine of creation from pre-existing materials. We can find arguments in favour of both ideas, as well as arguments against both ideas. And it might be tempting to think that these arguments and counter-arguments simply just cancel each other out, leaving us in a position where each idea is no more or less plausible than the other. But I don't think there's any reason to think that. After all, some of the arguments that we've seen are likely to be stronger than others, in which case one of the ideas is likely to be more reasonable or plausible than the other. And of course there may be other arguments and other objections that we've not considered yet. And once we take those ones into account, a clearer picture may emerge as to which of the two doctrines is most defensible from a philosophical perspective. So the mere fact that there are arguments for and against rival doctrines should not lead us to think that the situation is hopeless. If anything, it should make us want to look more deeply into these arguments and also to seek out any others that may be relevant in order for us to be able to make a more informed judgment between the doctrines.